Welcome to season 2 of the TSA Weekly podcast. I am not going to lie, as much as I have enjoyed having a little bit of a break from the constant just hamster wheel of content creation, I missed talking to you guys. There's been so many things that I have just wanted to talk about that I haven't felt like I had the outlet in the same way. So I hope that you guys are as excited about season 2 as I am. Yeah, let's just dive right into it. So the inspiration for this particular episode was actually another podcast. You guys know that I love Mel Robbins. I have actually, I believe, called her my spirit animal once before. I don't take that back at all. If I'm honest, I don't get the opportunity to sit down and really watch or listen to her podcasts because as fantastic as they are, they're long. One of the reasons why I'm going to work really hard to keep these episodes a little bit more bite-sized because I know as solo business owners, you guys are busy. You don't have time to sit and watch a 2-hour episode. But I do have to tell you that in certain circumstances, gosh, there's so much to get out of that. So recently, Mel had Jay Shetty on her podcast. I've been aware of Jay for a long time. I've seen clips from him and I've seen, quotes and things like that. But I really didn't know a whole lot about him. Honestly, when I first started watching the episode and they were doing his backstory, I was surprised to find out that he was a monk. So that tells you how much I really wasn't aware of his whole brand and his whole life story. Because obviously a big part of what he does and what he says. But I watched the entire episode and a lot of it is not, I'm not going to say not applicable to business, but not targeted to business. But a lot of it really, really was. And so that's the stuff that I wanted to talk about this week. I wanted to just kind of debrief and get out some of the thoughts that I had while I was watching this episode and just see what you guys think about it. Or maybe you watched it too and you took something in a different way. I just want to have a conversation about it because it was such a great episode. But before we dive into this, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and ring that little notification bell so that you never miss a tutorial or upload. All right, let's get into it. So there are going to be a lot of quotes that I'm going to kind of reference and talk about here because, man, Mel and Jay are both such quotable people. They say things and I'm like, oh, I got to write that down. So I definitely am going to be addressing quite a few quotes. But for me, there were a couple of themes that really stuck out to me when I was watching this conversation they were having. One of them being around what purpose really is. I think there's so much conversation in general, but especially in business and in the solo business world, I think maybe even more so than in corporate and larger businesses about what purpose actually is. And if you know Jay Shetty's stuff and you know him even more than I probably did before I watched this conversation, you know that purpose is like his thing. His definition, it was so simple, but so clear, helping me to understand, truly get the difference between passion and purpose because they are different. And I think we so often kind of treat them a little bit interchangeably. So that's something we're going to be talking about a little bit later. But I want to start with the idea of what keeps us stuck. I know that over the course of my time as an entrepreneur, I have gotten stuck many times. I've just recently was feeling a little stuck and, finding my way around getting unstuck. And they were talking a lot about what it really means when you're stuck. And this was something actually that Mel said. I mean, Jay agreed with it, but Mel was the one who brought it up. And what she said was, if you're stuck, what you're really doing is grieving a past version of yourself. When she first said that, I thought, really? I mean, even in business, I can understand that completely in personal life and things like that. But in business, does that really apply? And when I was thinking about it, I thought, yeah, I mean, it kind of does, right? I mean, especially if you're in a situation where you've been an employee your whole life and you want to start a business, but you just feel stuck. Even if you have this great idea, you might feel stuck and be a little bit paralyzed about stepping forward. Obviously, there are a lot of things to be stressed and worried about going from being an employee into being a business owner full time. But applying the concept of grieving a past version of yourself into that specific situation. As I was thinking about it, it just made so much sense because you're grieving that stability. You're grieving that person who knows where their next paycheck is coming from, who knows that they've got health insurance, who knows, that they've got benefits and things like that. You're grieving the life that that person lived, right? But what she said is, and this is a direct quote from Mel. She said, "What's holding you back is what you're holding on to." And wow. That sounds obvious, but it's kind of not, because I think we think what's holding us back is the future, the unknowns of the future, right? And those fears that we have. But really, what's holding us back is that we're holding on to the person who had that stability, who was able to live a certain lifestyle, whatever, that we might get to again with our business, but it'll take time. And so we're going to have to change how we live and change how we feel about our finances, about our time management, about all of those things in the meantime. And, in a lot of ways, that's a good thing, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it can very much be what's holding me back. And, it was just such an interesting way of looking at it, as being held back by something that we're not willing to let go of versus being held back by something that's preventing us from moving forward. Does that make sense? I don't know, it's just a different lens for me as far as how I look at the things that I feel are a challenge or something that I'm pushing up against within my business and wanting to move forward to something different. Which actually leads me to a quote from Jay as part of that same section of the conversation. And this was so ridiculously profound and simple, because we think about motivation and momentum and the things that are propelling us forward, right? And I don't know about you, but I've always thought of that as, dreaming, having a clear vision of the future, which we're going to get to that in a second. But having that clear vision, that's where that momentum comes from. That's where that motivation comes from. And he said something so counterintuitive, but major light bulb moment for me. He said, momentum doesn't come from knowing where you're going. It comes from knowing, I don't want to be here anymore. Yeah, that is that catalyst. That is that moment where we decide that we need to have a vision, right? Of where we want to be, of what we want to be doing. It is that the beginning, the spark of that momentum. And we need to realize that we got to ride that wave through. It's not that suddenly, once we have that moment of clarity of oh gosh, I don't want to be here anymore, then now we just have to have this beautiful, perfect vision of where we do want to be. And then that's how we get motivated. And that's how our momentum builds. That doesn't even make sense. And that leads into the clip that I want to share with you guys, because he was talking about this idea, what he called the biggest lie we've been told. And you know what? I'm just going to let him tell us.
It's not that I had a really clear view of exactly where I was going, or that when I left the monastery, I knew I'd be here today, or that when we launched the podcast, I knew I'd be here. And I want to get that thought out of people's heads, that if I don't have the full life mapped out and planned out, that I can't take the first step. Because I don't think I've ever known where my life's going. And so this whole idea that you have to have everything figured out before you take your first step is the biggest lie we've been told. This idea that if you don't have a clear vision, you don't know where you're going. It's the biggest lie we've been told. How could anyone possibly have every step mapped out? Tell me one person that we know in the world, anyone you look up to, that could tell you they meticulously knew every single step. They didn't, but they took that first step. And I think that's what's holding us back, is this idea that I have to know everything before I do one thing.
I don't think that we're necessarily verbally told this lie that oh, you got to know exactly where you're going before you could take that first step. But somewhere, somehow, that culture, that mindset, that mentality just has permeated the entrepreneur world. Maybe not even just the entrepreneur world. Maybe it's gone even further. Just that we have to have this clear vision of where we're going. And I loved him calling that out. As somebody who is obviously very, very successful, he is stepping up and saying look, I had no idea where it was going. I just knew that I didn't want to be where I was, and I needed to kind of do a 180 to start heading in a different direction. And then that was ultimately going to lead me where I was supposed to be, which he didn't really say it quite like that, but that's kind of the way I'm taking it, is that, it's almost better in some ways not to know exactly where we are headed, because adaptability is the name of the game. Where we think we're going to end up is like almost never where we actually end up. So I think that even more than it being a myth that holds us back from taking that first step, I feel like for me, it like holds me back from experiencing things that I couldn't even have dreamed of. Does that make sense? I think that feeling like we have this like crystal clear vision and we create our business plan. And let me just be clear. I'm not saying don't have a business plan. I'm not saying don't plan, don't strategize. I absolutely have plans and strategies and things like that. But it's about keeping them open. It's about staying open to what other possible opportunities might come your way and not being so like laser focused tunnel vision on this clear goal, this clear path that you'd set aside for yourself. Because honestly, if you do that, you're probably keeping yourself from things that are way better, but that you would never have even thought of on your own. And the reality is that growth doesn't happen from planning. Growth comes from action. So I think this is where my like two sides of I totally love and believe in messy action, but I also believe in process and systems and strategy. I think this is like where they meet in the middle. I think absolutely having strategy and having a plan and having a target is important. Having a level of clarity of where we think we want to go is important. And building processes and systems that help us go in that direction is totally important. But we can't have them fully designed when we take the first step. You have to take the first step first. That's why it's called the first step, and see what happens. And honestly, even then, our systems, our strategies, our process, they have to be flexible enough to be able to kind of move along with us as our steps take us in slightly different directions than what we expected. So I think that it just was such an interesting way. It's such a refreshing approach to that perspective of messy action versus actual planning, right? They don't have to be this or that. They can absolutely work together. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is what Jay gave as his 5 steps to change, because like super actionable. Get ready with your notebook because you're going to want to write these down too. But I want to touch really quick on his definition of purpose, because like I said at the beginning, purpose is one of those things that I think it's super important, especially as a solo business owner, as you are like figuring out all of the things that you need to know about your business, the why, the how, the what, the who, all of that. Purpose is so intertwined with all of those decisions and all of those realizations. But purpose is such an ambiguous word, I think. In some cases, we think that we're supposed to have one overarching purpose. This is like what our goal in life is, what our purpose in life is, why we're here. And, I've always felt like that's kind of an oversimplification. I mean, not that it's simple, because most people struggle to figure out what their purpose is because we're trying to say it's just one. But I think the reality is that we have lots of purposes. And his definition of purpose, so simple, it kind of goes along with what I'm saying. And I think frees us up a little bit to not feel like figuring out what our purpose is like our life's goal. So what he said was, purpose is simply using your passion in service of others. That's it. Well, here's the thing. We all have multiple passions, and we don't feel like that's wrong. We feel like it's totally okay for us to have a passion for this and this and this and this and that, right? Those passions can turn into a purpose when we use them in the service of others. And so in that regard, we can have multiple purposes. Now, are all of those purposes going to be something that fuels our business? Of course not, because all of our passions don't fuel our business. I mean, music is one of my passions. Acting, performing, being on the stage is one of my passions. And I mean, I guess you could argue that being a YouTuber is me using some of that passion in service of others. Maybe. But like in reality, it's not a passion that turns into a purpose for me here as a business owner. It is a separate passion. And if you love to cook, but that has absolutely nothing to do with your business, then that passion is just a passion. It's something you love. It's something that you enjoy. Now, if outside of your business, you take that passion and you start cooking and bringing meals to people in your community who, you know, are struggling to bring food onto their table for whatever different reason, well, then that turns that passion into a purpose. But does that make it the purpose that's supposed to define your business? No, of course not. So I think in simplifying that definition, he took something that looked simple on the surface, that you have one purpose, but was ultimately way overcomplicated. And he just made it simple again. And I don't know. I know that purpose is such a big part of his whole thing. It's a big part of what he talks about. It's a big part of his branding and all of that. And I think, having his background as a monk and really just having stripped everything back to that level of simplicity, I'm sure brought clarity in that regard. And I'm so glad that he shared that definition with us, because it opened up so many things for me. It just took me away from feeling like I had to figure out this magical unicorn of my purpose or nothing is going to work. You know what I mean? It was just so freeing to hear it spelled out in such a simple way. Okay, so now let's talk about his 5 stages of real change. I'm not going to go into a ton of depth on all of these. I mostly want to relay them to you, because if you didn't have the 2 hours and 51 minutes or whatever to watch Mel's episode with him, I want to make sure that you get these. So if you don't already have one, grab a notebook, grab a pen, because you're going to want to jot these down. The first stage of real change, according to Jay Shetty, is to learn. And I think this is one of those things that, all of these are kind of ongoing, right? None of these get completed. It's not like, okay, well, I get past the learning stage and I move on. You're going to have multiple cycles of change happening at any given time in your business, in your life. And so understanding what the different stages are and what they look like in those areas, I think, is super important. So stage 1 was learn. Stage 2, experiment. And this is especially true when it comes to my area of expertise, which is process and systems, because there is no right or wrong. I mean, you have best practices, but there are no right or wrong answers as to how a business is run and how somebody chooses to format the way they spend their time and how they set up their Trello boards even, right? So that experimentation, that trial and error is so clearly evident in my area of expertise. It's almost tangible because of that experiment. Stage 3 is perform. Stage 4 is to struggle. And stage 5 is to thrive. And the reason that I brought all 3 of those together is honestly because he kind of did. He was talking about how those 3, kind of along with 2 as well, because experimentation, trial and error is also an action. He was talking about how those 4 actions are actually what makes up reflection when it comes to change. I like to think of reflection as this peaceful, almost meditative state, right? Where, you're sitting and you're thinking and you're reviewing and, it's just very, I don't want to say passive, but it's not nearly as active as the way he was describing it. Whereas the experimentation, the trial and error, the performance of the new action, the new thing, the struggle as you find what works and what doesn't and kind of go back to stage 2 and experiment again, right? Until you get to the point where you're thriving. All of that, he says, is actually reflection. Reflection isn't just a mental thing. It is physical action. And that was a different way of looking at things for me. So I don't know, I found that really interesting. So, okay, I could talk about so many more things. And if this already piqued your interest, then I kind of suggest you go and watch her episode. I'll link it in the description so that you have easy access to it. But I want to just wrap up this episode with not even a question so much this time. It's more of a challenge. And this actually kind of came from Jay. So he asked listeners, and I'm going to ask you to reflect and act. And what he says is, if you're struggling to figure out what you should be doing, if you're feeling stuck, he says, ask 3 people. And he was very specific about who these types of people are. He's not saying just pick any 3 people and ask this question. He said, find 3 people in your past or present, someone you've worked with, a family member, a friend. And what he suggests asking them is, when you are struggling with something, what do I help you do? And or what problem do I help you solve? If you are feeling stuck as a business owner, you don't feel like you're going in the right direction, or even don't even know where to start to go in the direction of being a business owner, I challenge you to do the same thing. Find 3 people who fit into those categories and ask them, when you are struggling, what do I help you do? Or what problem do I help you solve? And I would love to see some of the answers that you get in the comments. I hope you liked that video, and more importantly, that you found it helpful. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with a fellow solopreneur. And make sure you check out the description for links to how we can connect and maybe even work together.